Hey everybody. So today we are going to be talking about um, a critical approach that often places itself in opposition to the traditional methods of critical theory that we have been talking about. It's sometimes called post-critique. The specific elements of it we're going to talk about today are also sometimes referred to as cognitive affective criticism. So there were three articles from the early to mid 2000s I asked you to read for today. There was an article by Elizabeth Hart, the Suzanne Keane article, and the Sarah Ammed article. So let's just kind of dive into post critique and what this is. It's often easier to say what it isn't. So, post critique, how do we define this? So this is a fairly broad term, um, and it's meant to include a number of different approaches to literary criticism that are primarily inaugurated in the early 21st century. So this is a much more recent critical development than many of the other things we've been talking about, which are rooted in some cases in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, and which really kind of take over literary criticism around the end of the 20th century. This term, though, can refer to just about any approach that is not directly descended from psychoanalysis, structuralism, or Marxism, right? Those have been kind of like the three key origin points for most contemporary literary theory. Post-critique aims to kind of move beyond those particular frameworks. In fact, a lot of critics who practice post-critique argue that the theory that was dominant in late 20th century criticism is no longer capable of really producing anything interesting or surprising anymore. That because these particular methods have been in use for so long, they've become formulaic, and the insights they produce are no longer revolutionary. So a lot of post-critique will focus on aspects of the reader's experience like aesthetic pleasure, cognition, and emotional response or affects. Right? So when we talk about affect, and we're going to be hearing that word a lot today. Affect is essentially a way that psychologists and psychiatrists often talk about the mechanics of emotional response. And if you notice some relationships between this and the phenomenological criticism and reception theory that we talked about a couple weeks ago, you would be absolutely right. That is probably the closest relative of post-critique in what we've discussed so far. All right. So where does this come from? A lot of this is based on the work of the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who died in 2005. And Ricoeur, as I said, is heavily influenced by phenomenology and by the reception theory of people like Wolfgang Iser and Hans-Georg Gadamer. And he's particularly noted for his definition of what he calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So hermeneutics, remember, is the science of interpretation. And he uses this term to refer to the methods common to Marxist, psychoanalytic, and structuralist critics. In fact, he calls Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx the school of suspicion. And he argues that these thinkers shared a similar view of false consciousness, right? That you'll recall from our discussion of Marxism, right? This idea that ideology blinds us to reality and leads us to identify with our oppressors. So Ricoeur argues that this belief in false consciousness leads practitioners of the hermeneutics of suspicion to believe that the surface meanings, the literal meanings of texts, are always suspect, are always deceptive. And the true meaning was usually unintentional and obscured even from the author. Right? Even the author doesn't know what they really mean because they haven't done the work to uncover these buried or hidden or obscure meanings that lie behind the false consciousness presented by the surface of the text. And Ricoeur, by the way, regards this hermeneutics of suspicion as not a good thing, right? Hermeneutics of suspicion does not sound like a positive thing, right? Or a positive attribute. So this idea is then further developed by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who makes a distinction between what she calls paranoid and reparative reading. So paranoid reading is that kind of suspicious reading that Ricoeur was talking about, right? A paranoid reading is one that doubts the surface meaning of the text and attempts to unmask the ideologies underneath it, right? So think paranoid. Right? When you're paranoid, you're convinced for no good reason that someone's out to get you. So a paranoid reader it approaches the text from the position that the text is trying to seduce you or convince you of things that it would not be good for you to believe, right? Reparative reading, on the other hand, examines the role that texts play in the lives of readers as sources of pleasure and emotional support, right? So it's from this idea of reparative reading that post-critique practitioners draw the basis for their practices, right? That what we should be paying less attention to these paranoid readings of texts and more attention to the role that literary texts play in the lives of readers. Now, the third big influence on post-critique is somebody we're actually going to be looking at a little bit later in the semester as we discuss his actor network theory, but the French philosopher and sociologist Bruno Latour. So Latour when he was looking at contemporary conspiracy theories, argued that suspicion had become the dominant mode of thought in Western societies, particularly on the political right, not the political left that was often the source of these kinds of suspicious readings of texts, right? So we can't count on the hermeneutics of suspicion to undermine existing hierarchies or to reveal lurking, hidden conservative ideologies in texts, in large part because the practice of critique has been co-opted for Latour by the political right. So the key figure in post-critique as a movement after the year 2000 is an Anglo-American literary scholar by the name of Rita Wolff. So Wolff argues that the traditional methods of critique, these kinds of suspicious readings that people like Ricoeur and Kosofsky-Sedgwick are arguing against, assume that texts are puzzles, traps, or even kind of covert criminal acts, right? That there's something nefarious at work in the text that you have to uncover or puzzle out to really read it properly. So Wolff, following Kosofsky-Sedgwick, argues that texts should be viewed as positive agents in human lives rather than as henchmen for reactionary worldviews. right? That we should be looking at the kinds of pleasure people draw from texts, the kinds of emotional responses that people get from reading a text, rather than accusing the text of, dressing up in jackboots and trying to frog march us into the gulag. And she encourages reading texts in terms of the emotions that they evoke in the reader. So again, like sort of very close in a lot of ways to reception theory, but reception theorists were really kind of more interested in the way we intellectually fill in gaps than in the feelings that are evoked by our readings. Postcritique is very interested in feeling. So Felsky offers three means of moving beyond the critique of the text. First, we need to think of the text as transhistorical, right? Yes, it is created in a specific historical moment, but that does not mean that the text's meaning is bound up completely in the historical moment in which it was created, right? It can have meaning outside of its specific historical context, right? So this is kind of a shot at the new historicists. The text as actor, right? She argues kind of let's focus less on what the text or what the origins of the text are and what ideologies are contained within, and more at the text as it is active in people's lives, right? How do readers receive and respond to this text? And finally, she argues for an affective hermeneutics, right? Remember, affect having to do with emotional response, right? That interpreting a text in terms of the emotional responses evoked in the reader is actually a positive and desirable goal and not something to be avoided the way the old formalists did. The way the new critics, for example, argued that to read affectively was fallacious, right? That we should be looking simply at the words on the page and how they relate to each other, not what feelings they engender in the reader, right? Feelings have, like, as a lot of the goal of 20th century criticism was to make literary criticism a little bit more objective and scientific. And so there was often a great deal of suspicion of emotion. So the scholars of post-critique are in many ways kind of trying to restore emotion and pleasure to the practice of critical reading. All right, so the first critic I asked you to look at was F. Elizabeth Hart, and weirdly, I could not find a picture of this person on the internet, so we've just kind of put Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man here because she is very much concerned with the way our bodies respond to texts in ways we'll talk about in just a moment. So Hart argues that the traditional literary critical view of genre as a type of discourse, right, that is a field of knowledge that is primarily inscribed in language, is what leads us to paranoid reading, right? This kind of our tendency, kind of coming out of structuralism and particularly deconstruction, not to trust language, to see language as a kind of slippery signifier, right, leads to suspicious readings. And that what critics really ought to be paying more attention to is the way the mind actually processes language. We can probably see some relationship there between what Hart is arguing in Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding theory, although Hall regards encoding and decoding more as a social practice than a mental process. So Hart is particularly concerned with what she refers to as the embodied mind, right? That is, the mind as a biological organ, right? That is, it's part of a body, that is a physical, fleshy thing, rather than simply as an essence. Because the material characteristics of the human mind and our sensory organs and their relationship to the mind shape the way we perceive and interact with the world. So since all human minds differ from each other, since all human sensory apparatus differ from each other, no two minds are going to process the same stimuli in exactly the same way. Therefore, our reading of a text or of a literary genre is always going to be subjective. It's always going to be shaped by our particular mental and sensory apparatus. So she also talks a bit about the role of memory in reading, and the way we tend to read the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. So to give you an example, in Marco Polo's travels, right, the medieval Italian merchant, diplomat, and explorer Marco Polo encounters a rhinoceros for the first time somewhere in Asia. I can't remember exactly where he said he was. So Polo has no concept of a rhinoceros. He's never seen one. He's never heard of one. Doesn't know what this thing is. But he has heard of a particular kind of creature with a single horn, a unicorn. So because he does not know what a rhinoceros is, he describes this creature as a unicorn. Says, but it doesn't look like you think it would. Got a bunch of gray scaly plates, and its horn is at the end of its nose rather than the middle of its forehead. But yeah, so he, in order to process this new stimulus, right, this new experience, he has to place it in terms of something with which he is already familiar. Now, Suzanne Keane, who is an American literary scholar and academic administrator, she was until recently the president of Scripps College, is also interested in neuroscience and in the brain as an organism. A lot of the work she does is concerned with linking literary studies to neuroscience. She is particularly noted for her work in what she calls narrative empathy. So some of this is based in 18th century philosophy. You might notice in her essay references to Adam Smith and to David Hume, both of whom argued that our moral impulses develop out of our ability to imagine ourselves in the circumstances of other people, right? So sympathy is the source of our moral life, our idea of morality. So, for example, I don't step on your foot, even if doing so would give me some sort of advantage over you, because I know that if you did it to me, it would hurt. So what Keane is doing is is applying contemporary neuroscience to a lot of these ideas and trying to connect it to literary study. So empathy refers to a vicarious, spontaneous sharing of affects. And reading fiction teaches us to imagine ourselves in the place of others. It puts us kind of directly in the perspective of another person. Now, empathy and sympathy are not the same thing, right? So sympathy means feeling for, empathy means feeling with. Empathy for Keane is kind of the building block of sympathy, right? Empathy, like feeling along with someone, is what allows us to imagine ourselves in the position where we would feel for someone. And because of this, narrative becomes a form of emotional contagion, right? In which affective states spread from one individual to another through reading. And it's not just based on identifying with the characters in a narrative. Since our knowledge of a character's fictionality limits our affective connection to them. Right, there's something else at work here. Like, Keane is one of these people who, by the way, is interested in the way, like she's interested in things like MRI scans, like watching, looking at the measuring people's brain activity as they are sitting in an MRI machine, and a lot of this work demonstrates that the parts of people's brains where feeling and empathy are processed tend to activate when reading fiction. Our empathic responses, meanwhile, are subjective, right? So this kind of connects with Hart's work and are based on readers' environment, prior experiences, and cognitive ability. Right? Readers with different abilities to comprehend a particular text, right, are going to feel differently as they read along with it, right? So the last of the thinkers I asked you to read for today is Sarah Ammed, who is a British-Australian gender and sexuality theorist and a literary scholar. So Ammed is interested in in kind of connections between emotion and economy, right? So she argues that emotions dictate and negotiate relationships between human bodies, right? How we feel is central to our relationships with others, right? Our feelings of attraction and repulsion. So emotions align bodies with particular social spaces and align individuals with or against specific communities. So in the example that she gives, from the website of the Aryan Nation in the example that you read, right? So this is, an example of a particular emotion of hatred of others aligning a certain subset of white people with one another and against outsiders, right? Against people who are not part of their particular affective group. So she also talks a bit about what she calls adherence and coherence, right? Whereas adherence is the binding together of individuals through some kind of affective attachment, while coherence is the collective or unity that is created through adherence, right? So through this shared emotional experience, right, a group develops a coherent that is going to affectively consistent identity. Now, by affective economy, what Ammed means is the circulation of an emotional experience through a coherent community, right? So just as Marx argued that a particular commodity picks up surplus value through being circulated within a community, Ammed argues that signs pick up a particular signs, symbols, words circulated within a community pick up a kind of additional emotional resonance that becomes a kind of surplus value, right? The values, the ideas that we attach to particular symbols are dependent on their circulation within a community. So like post-colonial theory, post-critique has attracted a number of objections. There are a lot of critical theorists who do not like these particular modes of reading. One of the most prominent being the scholar Bruce Robbins, who wrote a scathing article published in an issue of PMLA that really took down Felsky and a lot of other prominent practitioners of post-critique. So these are some of the most common objections that people have to post-critique. One is that because it's so based on emotional response that it really lacks any kind of intellectual rigor. Some also argue that its focus on subjective experience and its denial of objectivity leads to an anything goes kind of criticism, right? Well, you know, if everything is subjective, everything is based on your individual experience, then you can pretty much say what you want and no one can challenge you. A lot of critics also believe that the methods that are borrowed from the natural and social sciences are a really awkward fit with post-critique's stated goal of recentering human experience in humanistic scholarship, and particularly human feeling. That there seems to be a drive to quantify and measure emotion and affect that seems somehow kind of counter to the stated goals of the project. And it has also been argued that a lot of scholars practicing post-critique, particularly Felsky, either misconstrue or misrepresent the claims of Marxist, structuralist, and psychoanalytic critics. So Robbins, for example, has pointed out places where Rita Felsky seems to have taken quotes out of context in criticizing these schools of theory that she wants to present. Like, I'm not going to say is in opposition. Felsky does not present herself as being in opposition to traditional critique necessarily. She merely suggests that there are alternatives to traditional critique. But yeah, Robbins argues that some of these alternatives basically create straw man arguments by suggesting things that Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud never actually meant to suggest. Some critics of the academic left have also noted post-critique's disinterest in the kind of critique of power structures that what they call the hermeneutics of suspicion was engaged in, and argue that this is a de facto conservative, perhaps even reactionary position, right? That not taking a political position is a kind of de facto political position, a kind of defense of the status quo. You may recall that similar accusations are sometimes leveled at formalists and practitioners of the new criticism. Okay, so I'm going to post discussion board questions tomorrow. I hope I will see some responses generated by Friday, and we'll see you all there. Yeah, we'll speak on the forums, and I'll post another video next Monday. Take care, everyone.